Ladies and gentlemen, Marshall Brown.
Hello and welcome to Water Matters. I'm Marshall Brown. My guest this week is Thomas Schultz. Thomas is a co-founder and co-director of Friends of Bellport Bay. Their mission is to improve the quality of Bellport Bay by introducing oysters back into the bay and helping local municipalities to upgrade their stormwater runoff systems. Thomas is also a leading voice against closing the breach in Fire Island that was created as a result of Hurricane Sandy. On today's show, Thomas will be discussing Bellport Bay and his organization's efforts to improve it. So stay tuned for his presentation and a lively conversation. We'll be right back.
From the Grassroots Studio in beautiful downtown Port Washington, this is Water Matters with host Marshall Brown and special guest Thomas Schultz. Brought to you by the Jump In campaign and made possible in part by funding from the Long Island Community Foundation. And now, here again is your host, Marshall Brown.
Hello and welcome back to Water Matters. Today our guest is Thomas Schultz, co-director of Friends of Bellport Bay. Tom, you guys are doing some amazing work out there, and I can't wait for you to share it with our audience.
Thank you kindly. I'm humbled to be invited to be a guest here on this wonderful show, and honored to be part of a great company that have spoken before me.
It's been quite a ride for us. Thank you for coming, and we'll talk later.
Thank you. Again, thank you, Grassroots, for having me. Friends of Bellport Bay is actually a grassroots effort that started about 18 months ago. And the catalyst for this great grassroots effort was Hurricane Sandy. And a group of us got together in Bellport Village, and we decided that we were going to make a difference in the quality of our bay, Bellport Bay. So we developed a mission statement. It's a 4-prong attack, and today I will focus on our first 2 missions. And the first one is to support the new inlet that opened up due to Sandy by opposing the manual closing of the inlet and by keeping the public informed of its status. Our second initiative is to plant shellfish in sustainable areas in and around Bellport Bay. Our third and fourth initiative is to decrease direct nitrate runoff into Bellport Bay and to educate and update the public on pollution mitigation strategies. My other co-directors are Katia Reed and David Pate, and the 3 of us focus like a laser on our 4 missions. Initiative number 1, inform Bellport Bay communities and the general public of the current status of the new inlet, or what was known as the breach at Old Inlet. I'd like to take you back in time to an historical map. This map was created about 20 years after the Revolutionary War started, and it's a map of Bellport Bay. This is the Mastic Peninsula. The Smith Point Bridge to Smith Point Park would be approximately right here on the map, so it gives you perspective. This is the Patchogue Bay area. Back then, in 1797, there was an inlet which was labeled on this map as Southern or New Inlet. That inlet also exists on a map that was created in 1829. This is a map that actually shows the greater Great South Bay. Here's Fire Island Inlet. Here's what is now Heckscher State Park, Patchogue Bay, and then here's Bellport Bay, and you can see this little opening here, which was the inlet. It was later known as Smith's Inlet, named after the Smith family who occupied what is now the Manor of St. George in Mastic. But by 1857, the inlet doesn't show up on maps. This was a map created by the U.S. government as part of their first survey of the shoreline, and the inlet doesn't exist here. We do know that the inlet was closed by 1830, and that was due to several ships that foundered in the inlet, causing it to shoal up and close. Since then, the Fire Island area has basically remained the same. This is an area opposite Bellport known as Old Inlet. This little island is called Pelican Island. This island over here is called Ridge Island. If you look closely, you see a little T-dock there. That's the old inlet dock facility. What happened next, on October 29th, 2012, Hurricane Sandy slammed into our coastline, altering the shape of our shoreline forever. As most of us know, there were 3 inlets created in the eastern part of the Barrier Island system. 2 were closed immediately by the Army Corps of Engineers. They were hoping to close this other inlet that was created opposite Bellport, but we were able to keep them off the beach because of several reasons. One is it was in the National Wilderness District, and there is a contingency plan in place that says breaches shall not exist in the Wilderness Center. However, the National Seashore has done a great job amending that plan. This is what Fire Island looked like in that area before Hurricane Sandy, and this is what it looked like right after Sandy moved through. Here again is Pelican Island, and back then on November 11th, which is approximately 3 weeks after Sandy, the inlet took on a shape that was about 40 yards across, and it was kind of perpendicular to the beach. Here was that old inlet T-dock. Here's an image that I snapped from the Patasquash Gun Club, which was situated on Pelican Island. It's looking south over the Barrier Island. You can see in the center of the image that the inlet exists. Most of the sand that existed on the Barrier Island was pushed northward into Bellport Bay. At this time, Fire Island is connected to Pelican Island by the sand that was thrown northward. Here's an image I snapped of the inlet looking east towards Smith Point Park. Back then, 3 weeks after Sandy, the inlet was approximately 40 to 50 yards wide. Here's a great comparison slide. It shows the inlet, how it existed about 5 months after Sandy, on March 25th, 2013. The second slide shows the inlet how it existed this past summer, 3 years later. Although the inlet has changed shape, it wobbles, it rotates, the volume of water going in and out of the inlet has basically remained the same, according to the data. Here's another vantage point offshore that shows a 3-year span between March 2013 and April 2016. Again, the inlet has changed shape. As expected, inlets will migrate and rotate and eventually close, and so will this on its own over time. Here's a wonderful shot that shows the inlet looking east towards Smith Point Park, which is in this area over here. And this also captures the ice flow. You can see here that the ice in Bellport Bay was basically kept at bay because of the introduction of warmer ocean waters in February and March. And this is important when it came to Friends of Bellport Bay deciding where we were going to put our oysters. I'd like to take a moment and talk about what the National Seashore has been up to. They recognized right away that the inlet cut their national park in half. And according to a breach contingency plan that was in place, it stated that all breaches shall be closed manually. However, the National Seashore took a deep breath and decided that they were going to investigate this situation a little more closely. And I'm happy to report that they decided that the beach contingency plan that was in place was outdated, and it does not adequately address the management of breaches in the Fire Island Wilderness Center. So they decided to, as required by law, to prepare an environmental impact study. And the current status of that study is as follows. In September of 2015, they called out for an environmental impact study. On August 31st, they opened up a period of scoping and they collected public comment, which ended on October 8th. They are currently reviewing all the information, and they are scheduled to release a draft proposal as to what to do with the inlet later this summer in 2016. And there'll be a 45-day period where the public could comment on that draft proposal. It is our position at Friends of Bellport Bay that the inlet should not be closed manually. Why? This slide shows a good reason why. This slide shows brown tide. You can see this dark brown area in Bellport Bay and a lighter area near the inlet. This is a good example of how the cleaner ocean water, when it floods Bellport Bay, pushes the brown tide back or dilutes the brown tide, thereby allowing an ecosystem to prosper once again. Why should the inlet remain open or not be closed manually? Because here is another slide that shows the water quality in the greater Great South Bay, actually around Long Island in our harbors and inner waterways. Normally, in the early summer, there'd be a red dot at Bellport Bay. Patchogue Bay, the water quality is considered poor on this particular day. The water quality in the Mastic Moriches area is also considered poor. And sure enough, Bellport Bay would be also red at this time. But because of the existence of this wonderful silver lining that Sandy presented us, we have a green dot in Bellport Bay. And that green dot spreads east and west. It just doesn't stay in Bellport Bay. Here's a wonderful slide that overlays aerial photographs on Google Earth, and it shows the inlet as it existed last summer. I will note that this area here is where Smith's Inlet closed. So this new inlet, which we call Bellport Inlet because it opens up into Bellport Bay, is starting out where Smith's Inlet started out, and it too will migrate and move westward as Smith's Inlet did, and eventually close. But we oppose the manual closing of the inlet. I just want to take a moment to show you an image of Bellport Bay looking from the west bank of the inlet. You get a good idea of the sense of the clarity of the water from this slide. Although the water quality of Bellport Bay has improved greatly due to the existence of the new inlet, or Bellport Inlet, we decided that it was a great opportunity to do even more. So we decided that we were going to plant shellfish, because shellfish are excellent water filters. They remove nitrogen from the water column and deposit it on the bay bottom, where it becomes fertilizer for bay bottom plants. And that brings us to Friends of Bellport Bay Initiative number 2, to plant shellfish in sustainable areas around Bellport Bay. We contacted Cornell Cooperative and contracted with them to purchase 15,000 spat. Spat is baby oysters, and in this case, Cornell Cooperative hatches baby oysters on hard shell. We purchased through donations 15,000 spat. We also contracted with Brookhaven Town, and they donated last year in 2015 100,000 oysters for us to plant in Bellport Bay. We also collaborated with the National Seashore, and they allowed us to, through a permit process, plant shellfish within national park boundaries. We chose a location in Bellport Bay at a place called Ridge Island. This is a great location because not only is the fetch eliminated, the warmer ocean waters that come into the inlet in the wintertime will keep the ice away. And ice is the number one problem with destroying oysters on a shoreline. So we got to work. We got to work gathering the volunteers, bringing them up to the Brookhaven Town hatchery at Mount Sinai Harbor, Cedar Beach, where we began the process of sorting oysters. We took them out of Mount Sinai Harbor, we emptied them into sorting trays, we cleaned them, we scrubbed them, we separated them by size. We put them in bins and brought them down to Bellport, where a corps of volunteers got together and subdivided them into smaller containers. Here's an example of that subdivision into these little white containers. Then the volunteers loaded the oysters on a fleet of small boats, in this case, a bunch of little whalers. We transported the oysters out to Ridge Island, where the community got involved. They took their quantity of oysters. Paddleboarders, swimmers, boaters, sailors all participated, planting these oysters in a little cove on the south side of Ridge Island. Last year, in 2015, we planted 100,000 oysters and oyster spat. Volunteers came from all sorts of backgrounds, blue-collar workers, white-collar workers, kids, adults, older folks. We all participated. Our goal is to create an oyster reef in the south cove of Ridge Island. Here's an example of what the reef looks like today. This next slide shows you what the size of the oyster that we got from Brookhaven Town looked like in June of 2015. A little bigger than a couple of fingers. And this next slide was 5 or 6 months later. An oyster can take up one's palm right now. According to Cornell Cooperative, Greg Rivara, the oyster growth in this area is unprecedented. That's because the bay is full of nitrates. I just need to credit the great volunteers of Friends of Bellport Bay. Not only are we making a difference, we're having a great time doing it. And what's important to us is to ensure that the younger generation is involved, because it is they who will shepherd a better environment into the future. We can't succeed at creating a sustainable shellfish colony if we continue to pollute the bay. It is time that we act and decrease nitrate and pollutant runoff into Bellport Bay, thereby allowing the shellfish to flourish. We first must admit that we all contribute to the problem, and we must take action. And that is why Friends of Bellport Bay has 2 other initiatives. We are also assisting communities along Bellport Bay to improve and update their direct stormwater runoff systems. And we are also educating and updating the public on pollution mitigating strategies and results. Because we don't want to see this. And we're not far from this. This is a fertilizer runoff algae bloom. This is what we want to see. And we are close to getting there. You can find us on Facebook. And I thank you for your time.
Hi everyone, I'm Captain Waterman, and today we're going to talk about the ups and downs of our water supply here on Long Island. Up there is where our drinking water comes from. After it comes from, down there, about 250 feet beneath where I'm standing right now. If we could slice Long Island like a cake and then look at that piece from the side, we'd see different layers and a big vein, not of icing, but of wet sand. That's the aquifer that the water companies pull the water from and store in the top of the tower. And then, when you turn your tap on in your house, just gravity forces the water through the pipes right into your home. It's a very cool system. Now, there is an upside to this whole water cycle, and that is when the rain and melted snow leak into the ground, they have to run through stones and sand and soil. And there is some minor filtration going on, but certainly not enough to remove the toxins that we put on the soil, such as pesticides, fertilizer, and whatnot. On the downside, this aquifer is not housed in a room. It's not in a cave or a cavern. And when the water companies filter the water out of this, it creates a vacuum underground. And that capillary action invites in the seawater from Long Island Sound and the Atlantic Ocean. That's called saltwater intrusion. And that's a major downer, because when that occurs, that water is unfit for drinking. So the next time you hear somebody say, "So what if my father lets the faucet run the whole time he's shaving?" Or, "My mom takes really long showers," tell them stop, because they're pulling out the good stuff and they're inviting in the bad stuff. Oh, and that age-old excuse, "Faucets run in my family." That doesn't work anymore. I'm Captain Waterman.
The views expressed on the Soapbox are not necessarily those of Water Matters, its sponsors, hosts, guests, or underwriters. If you'd like to stand on the Water Matters Soapbox and sound off about a water issue, send your script to soapbox@liwater.org.
Hello and welcome back to Water Matters. My guest is Thomas Schultz, co-director of Friends of Bellport Bay. And wow, I mean, that presentation just blew me away. I love the work you're doing. But I think about how this all began. It all began with Sandy, and horrific. But even as the winds of Sandy were dying down, somebody from the Nature Conservancy phoned. We didn't have power for another 2 weeks after that, just to give you an idea. And he phones and he says, "You'll never guess what happened. Fire Island breached exactly where it needs to breach in order to flush Bellport Bay." He said it would cost millions to have done this. And so we tried to get out there as soon as possible, but I'm curious, you were living out there, you live out there, so tell us from your perspective how that all played out for you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. And Marshall, you're an inspiration to me and your organization, and our grassroots effort basically grew out of yours. Thank you.
Like Oyster Spat.
I lived through Hurricane Belle, Gloria, and of course Eileen. But there was something, we knew Sandy was going to be different, but there was something that felt different during that storm. I live in Bellport Village, and it's very common for us to, what we call hoop the dock. Every time we come back into town from a trip or a day trip, we go down to the dock, we check out the bay, we check out the National Seashore or the Barrier Beach, and then we could go home. And Sandy was moving offshore, the skies were clearing, and I finally got the opportunity to go down to Bellport Dock, which was wrecked. It was destroyed. But there was something else that was happening that moment. You could hear the ocean across Bellport Bay, unlike you could ever hear before. You still couldn't see the barrier island, but you could hear something very different. It was quite scary. And soon, the atmosphere started to clear, and you were able to make out the barrier island from Bellport Dock. And what was different this time, we've seen washovers. We've seen the ocean come over the dune line. But what was different this time, the entire dune line was being breached. You could see a white ribbon of ocean coming over the tops of the dunes in many areas. And then as the atmosphere cleared, you could see an area of the barrier island that was completely gone. It was missing. And I must say, I was frightened and scared by that because the barrier island provides us with a sense of security. Now there was a piece of that security missing. And I was petrified at first. But that led to so many wonderful opportunities right away. Within days after the sediment in Bellport Bay settled, the bay was different. The clarity of the bay was completely different than it was a week or so earlier. You were able to see the bay bottom off Bellport Dock, which is about 5 to 6 feet deep. You could never see the bay bottom off Bellport Dock. And I knew right away that this was an opportunity for us. And I had known that there was an inlet that was there years ago. And so I thought that this was a silver lining or blessing in disguise that Sandy gave us.
Well, still, there was a lot of fear, and it didn't help that for some 8 weeks after Sandy, we got a nor'easter, almost like clockwork.
That's right.
Every week.
That's right. And the flooding was rampant throughout the greater Great South Bay. Lindenhurst, Patchogue, we were all being flooded. But it wasn't because of the inlet, we learned. Although the inlet became a scapegoat for everyone's flooding problem. It was proven out by Charles Flagg that most of the flooding that we experienced on the weeks after Sandy and months after Sandy were regional events, not events isolated to the Great South Bay, and definitely not because of the existence of a new inlet.
It was up and down the East Coast.
That's right.
Yeah.
Chesapeake Bay was experiencing
far south as Florida, even.
That's right.
Right. Yeah.
And I knew right away that I had a job to do. And what that job was to make sure that the information, wherever it led us, the data, the science regarding this inlet, got to the public, so the public had a better understanding of what was happening. And if that data led us to conclude that the inlet was causing adverse effects to the mainland, so be it. But it was my job, I felt, to step up and coordinate community meetings where I invited scientists just such as Professor Flagg and Chris Gobla to come and talk to us about the science behind this inlet. And that put a lot of people at ease because they understood what was happening.
It did take some time, though. There was a lot of fear, and it wasn't helped by politicians calling for the breaches closure.
Right.
What a miracle! What a miracle it was that we had 3 breaches that night, as you mentioned. 2 were filled in immediately because it didn't happen on National Park Service's land. The very fact that it happened in the wilderness area meant that the breach is here today.
That's right. That's right. Because there was an extra layer of bureaucracy that was in place that actually helped us in this cause. And often red tape is difficult to navigate, and I was pleased to know that there was red tape involved here, ironically.
And what an inspiration to be able to see the bay bottom, something that people hadn't seen in 30 years or more in some cases.
Marshall, I get out to the inlet as often as possible. I've been there probably 100 times with my camera, and so I'm documenting the evolution of the inlet from the land. And I've come across seals. Colonies of seals have taken up residence inside the bay at times. Leatherback turtles. Sharks are coming in the inlet because the food chain is alive and well. It's teeming with life.
And the ospreys are doing real well.
That's right. They have plenty to eat now. They can see their prey. And it's just a wonderful ecosystem that I urge everyone to get to come contact me. I'll take you over on my whaler. I love doing that sort of thing.
Well, with Save the Great South Bay, we envision that the entire bay can one day be as clean as it is around Bellport Bay. And part of that comes from your oystering initiative. I mean, an adult oyster will filter, 50 gallons?
That's right.
So with the 100,000 you planted already, that's, 5 million gallons of water a day.
That's right, every day.
And that's not counting their propagation.
So we decided that we were going to plant shellfish because the algae blooms were kind of abated because of the fresh water coming in. And as we all know, it's the polluted, cloudy water that causes the colonies to die off as one of the reasons. So we decided to focus on oysters since they're the biggest water filters. And last summer, we put 100,000 oysters in the bay. I'm happy to report that Brookhaven Town is giving us, or donating to our organization, 300,000 oysters that we'll be planting in Bellport Bay. Our goal is a million oysters in 5 years, and we're well on our way.
That's amazing, and that inlet will close someday, and it filters about 8% of the bay per day. It's not nearly what Fire Island Inlet does, right. But if you could get that amped up so that the oysters can at least replace that. Now, we're also trying to get oystering revitalized along the South Shore, and a lot of that has to do with running a sewer line along the West Savo Oakdale. But it was a Professor Levinton at Stony Brook who said it would take about 5,000 acres of oysters under cultivation to solve 147% of the issue there. And that also bring back a $500 million shellfish industry. Do you see some commercial activity with your cultivation too?
Well, our colony that we're creating and the oysters we plant in Bellport Bay, the town and the state are working with us to make those areas off limits to shellfishing.
Okay.
We want these.
So no poaching people.
And we do expect some.
Right.
My wife's interested in having an oyster or two, but I tell her she can't.
Deservedly so. Oh.
We don't want these oysters taken from the bay because we want them to reproduce, and
Absolutely.
they will reproduce, and other oysters will settle elsewhere, and then that'll be open to commercial fishing. But we need to have a colony that is protected. We want an oyster sanctuary to take place in Bellport Bay that could continue to multiply and reproduce and feed the bay with new generations of oysters. And we have great partners with the National Seashore, the town, the county, and the state with regard to collaborating with us to make sure that these colonies are protected.
Now, what can people on the South Shore do to help your organization? What can they do?
So, Marshall, that's a great question, and thank you. You once described Friends of Bellport Bay as the lungs of the Eastern Great South Bay. We feel that when you could take part in something that is more intimate, like Bellport Bay for us, we live around Bellport Bay, so it's easy for us to focus on Bellport Bay. We hope to have organizations pop up all along Great South Bay, Friends of Patchogue Bay, Friends of the other bays that are part of the greater Great South Bay, so they could focus also like a laser, as we're doing, on their inner bay or their estuary or their creek or their direct conveyance runoff systems on the mainland like we're doing, and focus on their neighborhoods. And together as a whole, we will improve the quality of the greater Great South Bay dramatically over time.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, if all politics is local, all environmental politics is really local. We need to become stewards of our local environments. I mean, I look at what's happening in Lindenhurst and Babylon and Bayshore and Islip and Patchogue and, of course, Bellport and my own hometown, Savo. And that's where, it's where the rubber meets the road. Are you going to put organic fertilizer on your lawn or not? Are you going to use pesticides or not? These are all choices that make a difference to the bay.
That's right. And on that note, it's a pleasure to report that my 3 daughters, all under 8, understand that there are consequences to what they do on the mainland. Growing up in Brookhaven Town, I didn't know about the consequences, but I think the younger generations are learning that if they drop pollution or nitrates or fertilizer on the mainland, it's going to find its way to the groundwater in the bay. So I am optimistic that we have finally turned the tide. And it's in great thanks to folks like yourself and Kevin McAllister and folks who've been fighting this battle for decades. And I tip my hat to them because they've inspired me. And it is my great honor to be part of this great cause.
I'd like to give a quick shout out to Troop 217, the Bayport Blue Point Girl Scouts. They have a display in the local library. Take the organic lawn pledge, and that really makes your point that the kids get it.
That's right. That's right.
Well, I really want to thank you for coming, and just so much positive momentum. Oyster by Oyster will get our bay back.
That's right, Oyster by Oyster.
And you'll get, in Bellport Bay, it's just a jewel. There's one thing I would suggest upon closing here is, what if we had a GoPro camera or 2 out at the inlet, solar powered? You could see what's happening below water and above water, so that everybody in the world, not just on the South Shore, could see this miracle in progress.
No, when you get to see the situation or the new ecosystem that's being created at the inlet in person, you become a passionate ambassador for the cause. And a GoPro could make that happen for so many other people. Gives them a more intimate feel as to what's actually happening there.
Great. Well, let's do this. Let's do this. So good for you to come. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that'll do it for Water Matters. It's been a great season. We hope to see you again very soon.